Still in this social distancing. Last week we finished a study on dangers for people in recovery. And what I thought I'd do is go on to a new series called Back to Basics. And every couple of years, what I like to do is to just revisit some of the foundational material of what we teach so that people who are brand new can have an understanding of what complex trauma is, since we talk about it all the time. So how does one get complex trauma? How does it affect a person? And so I want to do that in just a short series. And what I like to do in that is not just kind of summarize what we've taught already, but to give you some of my new thinking, things I've kind of figured out, and also to present new research that's come or stuff that I've read that I hadn't read before, and pass that on to continue to fill out our understanding of complex trauma and its effects on people. When I started back over 16 years ago, the lady that trained me said, "Tim, the problem isn't the addiction. It's why they are addicted. What problems were they trying to solve by their addiction?" And that is what has led to the understanding that addiction, for 97% of the people, is trying to solve the issues from childhood, the pain that they have, and that's what we call complex trauma. And so I've been going through on this social distancing a book by one of the pioneers of research into trauma by the name of Bessel van der Kolk, and he's written a book called The Body Keeps Score. So I'm going to draw from some of his stuff plus some of my own thinking as we go through this Back to Basics series. Complex trauma is not just one-time event trauma, though it can include that, but it's trauma that goes on over a period of time, or when a person feels unsafe over a period of time, so that they live in fight, flight, freeze mode, survival mode constantly. In one-time event trauma, you go into survival mode, get safe, come back out of it. And that's a great system. Complex trauma is you're always in survival mode, and it begins to change you in negative ways. So that's the basic definition of complex trauma. Somebody's put together a list of types of complex trauma that a child could go through. So bullying we talk about all the time, but it could be a child that grows up where there's just a lot of violence in their community. So there's people getting jacked all the time, there's violence and abuse and murder and all of those things happening. And so their community walking the streets is not a safe place for them. So they're always on guard, on alert. Then there's the effect of natural disasters and people that live in earthquakes and tornadoes and hurricanes and all of those things. And if you're in a disaster area, it keeps you on guard. We are now experiencing the effects of ongoing terrorism activity. And for people living in certain parts of the world, that means living in constant danger. And with that has come out the refugee trauma. So people escaping war-torn countries, places of terrorism, and then living in refugee camps, moving to new countries as refugees, and all of the trauma that they have as a result of that. Then there's children who grow up where mom and dad fight, and there's lots of violence within the home that they witness, though they may never get hit, but they experience that. Then there's children who go through medical trauma, diagnosed with cancer or severe diseases, afraid that they might die, and living in hospitals and all of those kind of conditions for them. And then there's traumatic grief, when somebody dies who's very close to you, and the trauma that creates. And then we talk about abuse that is sexual, physical, verbal, emotional. We talk about parents who have a mental health disorder so that they're not able to parent you in the way that you need. What I found interesting in going back through some of the latest research is that they're now saying that the biggest cause of complex trauma in the Western world is neglect. So parents meet your physical needs, but they're not there for you emotionally. And you feel that they're in the same room, but they're not really present. And that kind of neglect makes a child feel all alone. They feel abandoned. And so those are some of the different types of trauma that a child can experience. Now, I want to talk about just some perspectives that I've been thinking about that might help you in your processing of understanding complex trauma in your own life. So the first thing I want you to understand is this. Complex trauma means that a child had to move from being healthy in the way they lived and had to adapt to a different type of behavior in order to survive. That is a key piece to understand. So let me present it this way. I don't know if you've thought about it, but children, for the most part, when they come into the world, they have good instincts built into them. A child, they want to connect with their caregivers, with their siblings. They want to be authentic and express their personality openly. They want to open up and tell you what's happening inside of them. They want to cry and express the emotions that they're feeling. They want to love. So that's all built into a child. So a child comes into the world with those good instincts, but let's say they're in a home where they're authentic, where they try to connect, where they love, express emotions, all of those things, and it's not allowed. They get punished, they get hurt, they get teased if they try to do those things. And so right away, the child is being told that to be healthy is bad because it will result in pain. So you must adapt in order to survive. And so the things that you do in order to survive, the adaptations, they keep you safe in the moment, but over time, they make you very unhealthy. And they prevent healthy relationships in the future. And the ways they give you to cope cause more pain and trauma in the future. And so that is complex trauma. That when a child is trying to be healthy, they are met with pain and hurt, so they adapt in order to survive. And so all of that is, I think, significant to understand. Now, let me give it to you from a little different perspective. Do you realize that when a child comes into the world, what makes them beautiful, what we look at them and say, that is such a precious little person, is not just because they're cute. It's because their innocence says, I am who I am. I want to connect with you. I want to love. I want to express my emotions. So a little child is very totally human. The way we were designed to be in expressing who we are. But what happens in complex trauma is they are not allowed to be fully human. And so their adaptations to survive really are becoming less human. More and more, they shut down their humanness, their emotions. They're trying to connect. And so adaptations that come out of complex trauma make people less and less human. And that is the tragedy of complex trauma. Now, let me give it to you from a different perspective, but they're overlapping. I think it's so important in understanding complex trauma to understand that complex trauma equals unresolved unmet needs. So if you think of a child in a healthy home who's hungry, who's sad, They cry, they talk, the parents come, they assess what is the need here. Once they figure out the need, they meet that need by giving them food, by giving them a hug, by letting the child talk. The need is resolved and the pain goes away. So an unmet need equals pain. In complex trauma, a child has a need, they cry, they express that need, and often they get punished for that expression of the need. They get told that they're selfish, but that need is not met. And so what does that then mean for the child? An unmet need that is not resolved means that you end up with unresolved pain. You sit in pain that you cannot resolve. And at some point, when you cannot resolve a need that is causing you pain, you then have to make decisions internally. So the child says, I don't want to live with this pain from this unresolved need. So I will harden myself. I will shut down so I don't feel that pain anymore. I will try to act like I don't need that need to be met. Or I will try to go fight, flight, freeze. I will just avoid. Or I will get angry. Or I will try to get that need met in an unhealthy way. I will adapt. And so complex trauma is all about unmet needs. Now, this can be really subtle. So you can have a child that grows up in a home where it looks like all their needs are met, but it could be that all their physical needs are met and some of their emotional needs. But if they have one or two needs that are not met and they've expressed it and asked for help, then they live with an unresolved need that is painful. And that will force them to adapt to survive that unmet need and the pain that it causes. So let me give you some examples. And these are all that can come out of complex trauma families. The obvious one is a child doesn't feel safe. And so if a child doesn't feel safe, they cry, they run to mom and dad. And if that gets punished, if they get a cold shoulder, if they get pushed away, then they have to adapt to find another way to survive because of the fear inside of them. And they don't want to keep feeling that fear, so they can harden themselves and act like they don't care and don't need anybody. Or they can do other adaptations to try and feel safe. This could happen at a subconscious level. And the solutions that they come up with seem to work at the time, but don't work overall. Another one, connection. So a child tries to connect. It's a powerful need. It drives them. They reach out to connect, and they are met with a wall. They are not able to connect. And so that hurts. That feels like something's wrong with them. So what do? They adapt. They try to find a way to not feel that pain anymore. Shut down, isolate, don't connect, say I don't need people, or start wearing masks and doing things that will enable me to find a pseudo connection where I feel like I'm connecting, but I'm not really risking exposing myself. And then being understood. So if a family does not understand a child, and we talked about this last week, that hurts a child. That's a huge need to be understood. And so they will try to explain themselves. They will try to present who they are. But if it's still not understood or it's made fun of, then what do? Adapt. They go find another group where they find other people like them where they are understood. Or they go find a group and they say, I will do whatever I have to do to fit in. And I will wear masks and I'll let them think they understand me. Huge needs not met. Value, validation, we talk about all the time. If a child's not validated, it's such a huge need, then they will adapt rather than sit in the pain of not being validated. So they will find other groups to validate them. They will get validation through different ways that maybe aren't healthy. Feeling loved. If a child doesn't feel that, it hurts like crazy. It makes them think something is terribly wrong with them, so they have to deal with that unresolved need. So what you're seeing is need after need after need. And if a child has 5, 6, 7, 8 of those needs that aren't met, that's a lot of pain to sit in. And that's what's happening in complex trauma. Being authentic. So a child is uninhibited in being who they are. They just put themselves out there. And they just say, here I am, here's what I'm like, here's my personality, here's my interests. And if that gets rejected or made fun of, then it hurts like crazy. And so they realize, I cannot be authentic. I must wear masks. I must do other things to be acceptable to this family. But deep down at a subconscious level, they think they've resolved that pain of not being able to be authentic and all those other needs, but it still hurts. And they still have pain at a subconscious level. A child needs to gain more and more control as they get older. If that is not met, if they're not allowed to have that, then they get angry. Then they rebel. And now they have this unresolved pain inside of them, the need for control. If a child sets boundaries with parents and siblings, and they don't respect those boundaries, then they feel pain. They feel that their wishes don't matter. And so what do? They adapt, but they still feel pain. And so they can isolate, they can get angry and drive everybody away. All of those things are unresolved, unmet needs. Then the truth. If bad stuff is happening, the natural instinct of a child is, I want to talk about it. But what happens if they try to talk about the elephant in the room in the family and they get shut down? And they find out you have to keep secrets around here. Nobody's allowed to talk about anything. Or if they do talk about it, they distort it and minimize it and justify it. So nobody's giving an accurate picture. And if they try to give an accurate picture, they get shut down. And so now you've got two unresolved needs. Number one, the situation in the family is not being resolved because nobody's talking about it. And the frustration and internal pain in the child is not being resolved because they can't talk about it and resolve it. So they have all kinds of pain. And so for some people, the only way to deal with that is to block it out of their life. Just to lock it away. Don't even think about it. Harden yourself again to all of that pain. So that's a lot of unmet needs, and I could keep going. But complex trauma is about needs that aren't met. The child tries to get them met. They get punished, so they have to sit in the pain of unresolved needs. Now, I want you to understand there's more than just the pain emotion that is happening here that they can't resolve. Because of the unmet need, they have now unmet or unresolved emotions, pain, but they also have unresolved fear. They can't make their fear go away because of the lack of safety. They have unresolved anger now. They can't fix the situation that caused the anger. So now they got anger that's unresolved. Then they're in conflict with family members, but they can't resolve that conflict because nobody will allow them. So that's unresolved. They are losing things, but they can't resolve their grief because they aren't allowed to. So they have unresolved grief. They have false guilt, failure, unresolved stress, all kinds of painful emotions that they are not able to resolve. Now, can you imagine the stress at a subconscious level to have so much unresolved pain and unresolved emotions, and unresolved needs. That's complex trauma. All of those unresolved things. So what I want to do in this series is talk a little bit about healing complex trauma in each of the talks. So let me start with this. This is a study that was done by a psychologist named Martin Seligman. And what he did was he did shock stuff on dogs. So he put dogs in a cage, and when they tried to get out, he would shock them. And after a while, they no longer tried to get out because they knew, or their brain said, to try to get out equals pain because of a shock. Okay, so after he had trained them that way, he put with them other dogs who had not been shocked in the same cage, and then he opened the door. The dogs who had not been shocked saw the way of escape and ran right out of the cage. You want to know what happened to the dogs who had been conditioned by shocking? They could see the path to freedom, but they would not take it. The only way those dogs would get out of the cage is if the person went in and grabbed them by their collar and dragged them out as they resisted being dragged out. So they saw the way of escape. They saw others escaping, but they were paralyzed by fear. And the only way was not just to explain the way of escape, not to just to explain that it was safe. That still wasn't good enough. You had to go in there and for the first few times drag them out until they became convinced that they weren't going to get shocked this time. And that's the reality of people with complex trauma. It's important to show them the way of escape. It's important to point the path to freedom and give them the tools. But for some, that still isn't enough. You have to push them to keep going, even though fear kicks in and is triggered and everything in them wants to run back into the cage. You keep pushing them until they feel empowered to keep on doing it themselves. So that becomes a starting point. Second thing I want to talk about, and Bessel van der Kolk does this very well, but it was one of the first things that I heard when I entered into the field of addictions and complex trauma. And it was to understand how our culture operates by what is known as a medical model. And what I mean is this. Our culture operates this way. You have a pain in your side that's not going away. So you go to a doctor. He meets with you for 15 minutes, asks you questions, does different things, maybe takes some blood, etc. Afterwards, he diagnoses your problem, writes a prescription and gives it to you, and you take those pills and expect that within a very short period of time, that pain will be gone, you will be fixed. So a medical model says a doctor looks at you for a few minutes, diagnoses your problem, writes a prescription, and you get a quick fix. Or he gives you a technique that will, in a very short period of time, get you better again. So our whole health model is built around quick diagnosis, quick solutions. And what Bessel van der Kolk found as he started his career as a psychiatrist is that he grew up and he was working where that was the mindset towards trauma. That you just diagnose the trauma, say, here, take these pills, or here, do this technique, and you'll be all better. And he found that does not work. Trauma cannot be solved with the current medical model. There aren't quick fixes. Now, when I was thinking of redoing this or doing this series, I thought, you know what, I'm going to go on the internet and I'm going to go to all the major trauma sites, web pages, and look at all the latest research. And as I did that, I got more and more discouraged. Because what I found is the whole approach to trauma, the vast majority of places, is do this technique and it'll fix you. And that has not been my experience. I wish it was. Now, let me explain that, because I don't want to make it sound like I'm against techniques. I have had many people that I work with say, I was thinking of going and doing that stuff where they use music and sounds to reprogram your brain. And others saying, I'm doing some tapping exercises. And then others, I'm doing EMDR, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what I say to all of them is fantastic. Those you will find to be very helpful. But if you think that just doing that will take care of all your trauma, I think you're wrong. At some point, you still have to go back to those deep places, to those deep unhealed wounds, and begin to work on that. That, combined with techniques, becomes the path forward. But our society is so hooked on quick fixes, magic solutions, that people still run off after that and say, why do I have to look at all of that painful stuff? It reminds me of when I was a kid. My parents brought in a foster daughter, and she was about 10 years older than I was and was training to be a nurse. And one day when I had a Band-Aid on my hand or my arm for a while, and it was really time to take the Band-Aid off, I started to take it off and stopped because it was pulling all the hairs out of my arm. And she came up to me and said, just yank it off. And that just froze me, because I knew that was going to be a lot of pain, that was going to be very intense. But she said, it only lasts for a second, then it'll go away. And what I find with people going back to the pain is they're afraid to open that wound because they think the initial pain will go on forever. And the reality is, it's like that Band-Aid illustration. Yes, it's going to hurt initially, but it's not going to last very long as you begin to work through it. And so what we're going to propose in all of this is the importance to go deep, but also the importance to handle symptoms today using various techniques. So the next thing that I think is foundational is the importance of self-awareness. I have clients all the time who say to me, give us solutions. Why do we got to look at all this understanding how our trauma affected us and where it came from? So let me read you what Bessel van der Kolk's mentor said. People can never get better unless they become aware of what they know and feel. And what he means by that is unless they become aware of what they know and feel at a subconscious level. So it's important to understand, and brain studies have shown this, that complex trauma and living in the survival mode that comes out of that operates below the awareness of the conscious brain. So it operates at a subconscious level. And many of you can relate to the fact that you were triggered and you went off and did all kinds of things and you weren't even conscious of what was causing you to act that way, what was going on deep inside of you. And so what they are saying is this: you cannot change your behavior unless you take what is operating subconsciously and bring it to a conscious level so you're aware of the dynamics of what's happening inside of you. And so that's why I spend so much time on self-awareness, because I know that people can't change behaviors in lasting ways unless they begin to bring the subconscious to the conscious level and understand what's going on so they can see what tools to apply and what needs to be fixed and changed. They can see what is unhealthy, what triggers patterns in their behavior so they can change it. So self-awareness is critical. Secondly, People need to be able to put words to their story. They have to be able to talk about it, even though it's painful initially. So what they have found is trauma, especially for younger children, is so intense that it gets locked away and they don't even try to put words to it because they don't have the words at that age to describe it. And so it sits down there as this black, dark, painful thing that has no description. And so I think one of my roles is helping clients put words to their pain. And what I have seen is as I help them find the word to describe their pain, it's like a load comes off for them. Now they can define it. Now they can talk about it and present an accurate picture of it. Now that's not the only solution. It's a part of the big solution, but it is an important part of that solution. Now, let me give that to you a little differently. When a child from a healthy home goes through a very painful event, they have parents who help them talk about it, put words to it, put words to their emotions, and then they get comforted, they get tools, they get taught, and it turns into a positive growing experience. That child's memories of that event, as they have resolved it, they will go from painful memories to being harmless memories that kind of fade. But in trauma, when nobody helps the child put words to it or resolve it, they are stuck in the pain. And the memories do not fade. The memories continue. And so part of what we're doing is giving people the words and the tools to finally look at that pain so that now they can resolve it. I don't take people to pain just because I think, oh, it's good that you go to pain and just sit there. We take people to pain so they can understand it and resolve it. And that is essential. Now, let me give you a final study. It was done, I think it was in the 60s or 70s, with mice. And what they did was they took mice and broke them into two groups. And the one group stayed with a very loving family in a very structured, organized world. And the others were put in with very chaotic mice. There was abuse, there was neglect, there was a disaster. I don't quite know how they created that, but that's what happened. And then they let both sets of mice out to go and play for an extended period of time. And then once the mice were all playing, they created these very intrusive, loud, scary noises. And watch what the mice did. Guess what the mice did? They scurried back to mom and dad. And what was significant was this. We could understand that mice from a loving family would scurry back to mom and dad, but the mice that had been abused and neglected by mom and dad, they scurried back to them. They didn't care if it would result in more abuse because their triggers said, go back to who should be your rock. And I've seen that happen in many, many clients, is that they get out on their own and then they get triggered and they scurry back to people who abuse them. And so it points to the need to develop a healthy, loving support network made up of loving people. So that's an introduction to back to basics. And next week we're going to look at new research that's out on the brain and what complex trauma does within the brain. Fascinating stuff. But I hope just in kind of repeating the whole body of complex trauma information from little different directions, that'll just help you understand your own a little bit better and the importance of the tools in healing and moving forward. So that's the end of part one. Again, I'm going to take a minute break and then we'll come back and do the Christian part. And if that doesn't interest you, not a problem. turn your phone or your computer off, and we'll see you next Friday. Well, welcome back for the Christian part. And I told you I wanted to start telling you some of the stories from the Bible. And today I want to tell you the story of a man just after the time of Jesus in the beginning of the early church by the name of Philip. And we find out about him in Acts 8, 7, 6, those three chapters. And the focus that I want you to think about with him is dealing with frustrating interruptions. And I think for a lot of people with this COVID-19, your life was going along, and for some of you, it was really going on an upward trajectory, and things were looking good and positive, and then this happened, and it was a frustrating interruption. And you're maybe still finding yourself frustrated by it. And Philip, I think, provides a wonderful illustration of dealing with frustrating interruptions. So let me give you just a little bit about him. We're first introduced to him in Acts chapter 6. So Jesus dies, resurrected, goes back to heaven, and then the book of Acts begins, and a church or followers of Jesus comes into existence in Jerusalem. And Philip becomes one of those early members of the Christian church. And we're told that he was a very godly man, which meant he was just sold out to following Jesus, to living his life by God's design, by loving others, loving God. Then in Acts 7, the church hits its first kind of challenge. And what it is that there's a bunch, it's growing so fast, there's a lot of people whose needs aren't being met very well. The widows particularly. They didn't have anybody to provide for them. And so some were complaining because some widows seem to be favored over other widows. And so the church leaders get together and say, we got to solve this problem. So they decided to pick 7 men to kind of manage, to make sure that the people's needs were being met. And Philip is one of the men who's chosen, and it's partly because of his godliness, but also because of his administrative abilities. So he's a talented, gifted man. And then in Acts 8, there's persecution, the second big thing that starts. And the church begins to spread. And because people are running for their lives to avoid persecution. And Philip finds out that there's this area in Israel that's kind of cut off from Israel called Samaria, where there were half-breed Jews that had intermarried. And so they were hated by the religious leaders of Judaism. But Philip goes there and he starts to tell them about Jesus. So let me read to you what it says. A great wave of persecution began that day, sweeping over the church in Jerusalem, and all the believers except the apostles were scattered through the regions of Judea and Samaria. But the believers who were scattered preached the good news about Jesus wherever they went. Philip, for example, went to the city of Samaria, which was the capital of Samaria, and told the people there about the Messiah, Jesus. Crowds listened intently to Philip because they were eager to hear his message and see the miraculous signs he did. So there was great joy in that city. In other words, what happens with Philip is he goes there and things explode. People in tens, in hundreds, even thousands are coming together to hear him preach. Many are deciding to follow Jesus. He is experiencing phenomenal success in this new ministry. It is looking so positive. It is looking like it'll just keep growing and be even more effective. And then we read this. As for Philip, the Lord said to him, "Go south down the desert road that runs from Jerusalem to Gaza." In other words, God interrupts his successful ministry in Samaria. And he says, I want you to leave this success, this booming infant organization, and I want you to leave that and go down to the desert. And I think it was the literal desert, but I think it also was a play on words to say a place where nothing really is happening, a dead place. And so he started out. He obeys, and he met the treasurer of Ethiopia, which is an African country, a eunuch of great authority under the Kandake, the queen of Ethiopia. So to get from Africa to Europe to Asia, you had to go through Jerusalem. That was where the main road went. So God is saying, go and find this lone human being, and I want you to talk to him. So the eunuch had gone to Jerusalem to worship, and now he was returning, and seated in his carriage, he was reading aloud from the book of the prophet Isaiah. And we're going to look at more at the eunuch next week, but I want you to think of what that was like for Philip to get that instruction from God. Philip at that time was probably one of God's servants that was seeing the greatest results happening through his preaching, through his caregiving. It was a time of explosive growth. And God is saying, step out of that and go to a dead place and talk to one person. I think Philip might have said, God, what are you doing here? I'm your most productive man right now. Why are you taking me out of that? That's going to stop the productivity. And you're asking me to go and not use my gifts and abilities the way they've been used and just talk to one person? Wow, God, that kind of hurts. It kind of is like you're saying I'm not good enough, or you're putting me on the shelf or something. I'm not liking this. Such an interruption that kind of felt personal and in a negative way. And I wonder if Philip was going through that. And I wonder if some of you have gone through times where you're just seeing God work in your life and good things happen, and all of a sudden something happened and it takes you out of all of that. The beauty of Philip is he trusted God. He was surrendered to God to do what God wanted no matter what. Even if it meant walking away from great success, great growth. He was willing to obey God and do what God wanted. And so we see within this successful person a humble heart. A heart that still trusted God and submitted to him. And that is the beauty of Philip. Now I want to just take you a wee bit ahead in this. Can you imagine, again, what it was like for Philip going there, talking to this man, leaving him, not really knowing much beyond that. But you want to know what happened in the rest of the story? That Ethiopian eunuch was high up in the government. He became, through Philip taking the time with him that day, he finally understood who Jesus was and why he had done what he had done, and he became a follower of Jesus. He went back to Ethiopia, to his very influential job in the palace of the queen, and God used that eunuch to touch the hearts of many, many people in Ethiopia. And Ethiopia became one of the thriving areas of growth of the message of Jesus. Thanks to Philip accepting God's interruption of his schedule, accepting God seeming to take him away from where all the success was, and talking to one person, not knowing the point of it until probably he got to heaven. And then thousands of people from Ethiopia would say, thank you for talking to the eunuch that day out in the desert. So what do we need as we go into interruptions? The two things of Philip: the humble heart that trusts that God knows what he's doing, and the humble heart that just continues to submit, to live the way God wants, to do what he wants with my life, to trust him in all of that. And I hope that Philip's poignant story just helps you where you're at, whether you're in not just a COVID-19 interruption, but other interruptions are happening, that you'll be able to trust that God knows what he's doing and surrender afresh to him. Let's pray. Father, I'm so thankful for the story of Philip, for his heart attitude, and I just pray that we all would have it, and that you would just speak to each heart that's listening where they need to hear your voice, and that you would just, again, bring us to fresh trust and surrender. Amen. Thank you again for being part of Finding Freedom via live streaming on YouTube. We'll see you next week.